Good evening and welcome to this Holberg Prize event, the Holberg Laureate Live. A special welcome to Holberg Laureate Paul Gilroy and Professor Thomas Hylland Eriksen, who will have a conversation on conviviality in a seamless world. The Holberg Prize, which was founded by the Norwegian Parliament in 2003, is regarded as the equivalent of the Nobel Prize in fields where there are no Nobel Prizes, namely humanities, social science, law, and theology. Professor Paul Gilroy, who received the Holberg Prize in Bergen yesterday, is Professor of American and English Literature at King's College London. From August this year, he will be the founding director of the new Center for the Study of Race and Racism at UCL in London. The Holberg Committee points out that Paul Gilroy is one of the most challenging and inventive figures in contemporary scholarship, whose work has influenced and in some cases reshaped several fields and subfields, including cultural studies, critical race studies, sociology, history, anthropology, and African American studies. The Holberg Committee regards Paul Gilroy as a courageous and inspiring figure whose work has been transformative, dealing with some of the most pressing issues of our time. Paul Gilroy will be further introduced by Professor Thomas Hylland Eriksen, who will now have a conversation with the Holberg Laureate. Thomas Hylland Eriksen is Professor of Social Anthropology at the University of Oslo. His research has focused on identity politics, ethnicity, nationalism, and globalization from a comparative perspective. In addition, he has published popular books, polemical books, and essays on a variety of topics. He is also well known in many countries for his textbooks in social and cultural anthropology, including Ethnicity and Nationalism, Small Places, Large Issues, and What is Anthropology? Currently, he is working on a research project on overheating, the three crises of globalization, which is funded by the European Research Council. Now, the topic is conviviality in a seamless world. Thomas Hylland Eriksen, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Yeah. So thank you very much for this introduction. You just said that I was going to give a more comprehensive introduction of Paul Gilroy, and I was actually just going to say that, well, Paul Gilroy needs no introduction from me. But I guess I should add a few things to what you already said. As you would realize, Paul Gilroy is a rather central figure in the way in which we think about the contemporary world. So I see him as, in addition to the specific empirically based works he has done, such as Black Atlantic, or before that, There Ain't No Black in the Union Jack, which is a great title for a book, by the way. I thought it was a rap text, you know. When I first heard the title, I thought, this must be Linton Kwesi Johnson. And then it was Paul Gilroy, and it's also an important book, following which he wrote perhaps his most complex book in some ways, one called After Empire, confusingly entitled Post-Colonial Melancholia in America. But it has melancholia in the subtitle in English. It's in Britain as well. It's called Melancholia or Convivial Culture, which are posited as alternatives. So, as you will realize during this conversation, when I give the floor to Paul, he has contributed in many ways to the ongoing critical conversation about who we are, what the word "we" is meant to be, and what it implies, and perhaps where we're going and where we want to go. So there is knowledge, there is criticism, but there's also a lot of hope in Paul Gilroy's works. And to me personally, one of the most sort of wonderful experiences I had with his writings when I first read many years ago The Black Atlantic was the fact that we had read many books about slavery. They'd all, or mainly, been about suffering, oppression, inequality, violence, uprootedness, and the tremendous loss slavery inflicted on West Africa, which lost a generation or several generations of people who would otherwise have gone on to do great things at home. And yet the book is permeated by reflections on and a celebration of cultural creativity. So that is, you know, what some have spoken of as a miracle of creolization. I think it was Michel Rolfe-Trouillot, the Haitian-American anthropologist, who used that term, the miracle of creolization, the fact that so much inexplicable suffering and misery has led to this wonderful cultural creativity, which continues to reverberate throughout the world. So would you, perhaps we should start commenting on that. How can this suffering have led to something so positive? I mean, that's the history of, all the rhythmic music we have mainly comes from that historical experience.
Well, thank you, Thomas, for being so generous about my work, and thank you to Professor Gilroy for the introduction. Thank you, everybody, for coming out this evening and being soaked on the way here. Obviously, you'll be soaked on the way home too, so thank you for that in advance. And thank you also for picking out the connection between Linton's imagination, creatively speaking, and my own academic work in a way, because he, although he's a little bit older than me, is someone who gave us our voice, gave us a kind of understanding of our particular historical mission, you know, and gave us the seeds of a certain vocabulary with which to think the cultural insurgency of which we were part. He calls our generation a rebel generation, and I'm sort of proud, really, to be affiliated to such a thing. So the connection is there. With regard to the title of the book, I was always very surprised when I first went to the US, where nobody wanted to publish this book, and I was giving a talk about it, and someone in the audience replied to what I'd been saying, and they said they referred to the title of the book as "There Ain't No Black in the Union, Jack." So there is a kind of misappropriation of culture and traveling, you know, opportunity that even comes through that. But I think it's really important to point, as you've done, to the way that horrible history of suffering, which in so many ways surpasses our capacity to render it in the form of language, has been immensely generative. It's productive. It has been productive. It remains productive. Its half-life is still culturally productive. And I wonder about that, because I'm very much against the idea that suffering's redeemed, or suffering can be redeemed by beauty. Mm-hmm. The suffering can be redeemed by cultural fertility. I think suffering is really just suffering, and there is no redemption, and one must face that somehow. Yes. But that wasn't, in a way, there's a kind of, there are acknowledgements in that culture, which should be a culture of loss, and much of the time is a culture of joy and a culture of love, actually. And even from the hold of the slave ship, those two possibilities are articulated with great fluency and great power and great reach. The struggle really was always in becoming interested in such things with the help of anthropological writers and thinkers who had addressed those questions in a number of contexts, not least, of course, Roger Bastide, and others in looking at Caribbean culture who had done something similar, to combat the view of culture which was being pinned into a fluid situation, into a complex contact zone, and reduced, always oversimplified, always, because of its proximity to questions of racial hierarchy and racial difference, always rendered as a binary thing. Either you are this or you're that. You know, the logic of accretion was missing there, and with it a sense of culture, which I think we've talked about this once before. Yeah. This idea that in so many languages, this notion of culture is always attached to the land, always attached to the soil. I mean, I know in Norway this is also a more complicated story, but we're dealing here with a culture which is a fluid phenomenon, a fluvial, a pelagic phenomenon, something that's a watery, a liquid thing. So culture isn't fixed and stable and still on the shore, and then people are herded at the point weaponry into the hulk or the stinking hulk of the ship, and then culture suspended until they emerge at the other side of their journey anew. There's a sense of process, of creativity, of accretion, of accumulation in that ship. There's a language lesson there. There's a cultural lesson there. There's something being added to the discourse. And this is fundamental to remember, especially now that the sort of romance of suffering has been so attractive psychically to so many people who try to interpret the results of this history.
Yes, and also people who try to create these fixed, bounded identities attached to place. So one of the things that you did in the Black Atlantic, but also in many of your other works, is to emphasize mobility and connections, often across the sea. And I have thought often about this part of the world as having been part of a North Sea culture, you know, based on contact and relationships, and not on isolation and boundaries, through fisheries, through trade, and so on and so forth. So that even now, when I travel to Newcastle, I feel slightly less abroad than if I go to Bristol. If you see what I mean, or Liverpool, because you have this North Sea feeling, the Netherlands. So aviation did a lot of harm, not just to the environment, not just to climate, but also to the way of thinking about the sea as something which connects.
Yes. Well, that's right, because I think, and there's another, I suppose, issue which is slightly pre-aviation conceptually, but has the same, or compounds that problem, which is that people begin to see or approach water as a dividing phenomenon rather than a connecting phenomenon. And I think if there is a methodological fruit to be gleaned from Black Atlantic, I would suggest that it's probably that sense of the Atlantic, and other scholars have tried to adapt that model to other bodies of water as a kind of negative continent. A negative continent. So we look at the rim, the circum-Atlantic rim becomes a place connected by these. And of course the history of colonial adventures across the Atlantic is very much one of linking places and smaller journeys before it becomes a kind of totalizing space.
Yeah, and when you speak of the Black Atlantic, you don't speak of, as it were, you don't call it African. So because something new developed. Something new is being, and of course again, this is, you know, a long time after that book was published, this is still something that people have trouble with. And I do get beaten up periodically for daring to suggest that novelty should merit our attention. Yeah. And of course, it is African, but it is not just African. And it's complicated because the feedbacks are complicated. So, you know, when we have, I don't know, returnees from Brazil going to Lagos and bringing with them certain cultural, musical, in this case, innovations which are then reseeded into the compost of West African commerce and urban space, and some of which is good and some of which is bad. But that means that we're dealing with flows which are not one directional. We're dealing with flows in several directions, and we need to develop a complex form of analysis which can function on a number of different scales simultaneously to accommodate that. Yeah, I guess so. Yeah, I mean, you have this sort of you might say diasporic population of African origin, and those people who came from various parts of mainly West Africa, but also other parts of Africa, were in the space of just a few generations amalgamated into one identity, right? And then I'm just wondering, would it make sense to speak of a virtual diasporic African identity in some African cities as well? People who listen to reggae music, who are part of, the same, they eat the same food, and, they relate to African American, as it were, and Caribbean culture.
I think that's true, but I think it has to be periodized very, very carefully. Yeah. And I think that actually there are a number of phases we might identify. There is an early period where, I'm not theorizing, I'm just thinking. There is, I think there's an earlier period really where Pan-Africanism as a phenomenon growing through often the movements of African intellectuals to the United States for education, and from that we get people like Sol Plaatje, the founder of the ANC, or people like John Chilembwe, the most interesting rebel, who were sent by the missionary interest across the Atlantic to study in historically black colleges in the United States. Yes. And by their exposure to those environments, those institutions, there are certain seeds, certain possibilities that are fostered, nurtured in them. So that would be, I guess, phase one. And we know that the early literature of the Pan-African movement in the world is well, I suppose the Pan movements generally, the end of the 19th century, they dream also of a certain cosmopolitan possibility. Du Bois is the obvious avatar of that, and he's somebody who, you know, goes to the Universal Races Congress in London in 1911 and has this sort of extended fantasy in which all the coloured peoples of the world, all the colonized peoples of the world will somehow combine and act together and rise up against the colonial power. And he doesn't really know what to do with that vision. He gets sucked back into a kind of national frame by his own need to adapt from being a university teacher into being an activist of a certain sort. And then when the 1930s comes along and he's older and he's finished Black Reconstruction, or while he's writing Black Reconstruction, he's also writing a novel that accumulates, that communicates this image, you know, which is a striking thing. So that would be phase two. Yes. And we know that people like Senghor and Césaire and the others were reading Du Bois and thinking about Du Bois and thinking about Padmore and so on. And then, you know, with Black Power again, it changes, and with the concept, I suppose, with the rise of Cold War politics, it changes again. And then we have the split between the Malcolm X voice, which is really a political project which foregrounds the issues of human rights, and the domestic United States project, which is one which foregrounds the issue of political rights. And then, you know, you get James Brown and Nina Simone and all of these cultural people coming to West Africa, playing in Festac, and it's there on film. So you see B.B. King and the Voices of East Harlem playing with Fela and playing with African musicians, and that Creole conversation is really something that's being rendered attractive not just to African Americans, not just to Africans, but also to the people who are consuming these new emergent popular forms of black music as a kind of adjunct to rock music as well. Yes. And now the digitalization of that culture, the loss of value in the political economy of selling the music, the Black Panther, the Beyonce, this moment. In fact, even those things are old because the accelerated pace at which this process unfolds.
Yes. Yes, well, you've not just got a very sort of potted history of.
Sorry about that.
Not at all, but it was great. But of some of the dimensions of the Black or African American or Black diasporic identity movement in the last century, with an emphasis, I guess, on music, but also on politics. And we could have mentioned that. We could have spoken about Marcus Garvey, for example. I mean, there's also who wanted to do things in the real world. Senghor and Césaire, who were Caribbean or West African intellectuals studying in Paris and returning to their homelands and had major political careers. Senghor was president of Senegal. Césaire was mayor of Fort-de-France in Martinique for about 40 years, I think, before retiring. So they were very major figures. And whereas Marcus Garvey was more a man of action. He sent people back on ships.
Yeah, it's a complex and interesting figure who in many ways is responsible for the fact that I'm in this room at all, even though I have an extended critique of his positions. Of course, then my potted history left out the question of reggae, which you had raised. So let's add that to the mix and say that the moment of Ethiopianism, which I suppose the seeds of which are planted in the rebellion in Jamaica in 1938, which is strongly articulated through the biblical categories of the Exodus narrative, and feeds into the kind of Rastafari movement that will flourish in Jamaica and be picked up really and extended and transformed worldwide. And yes, I guess in many ways I'm an affiliate of that project. As I try to show.
Yes, and I think one of the important things that you get across in your writings about music, identity, race, is the universality of some of this. That it's not about bounded, as it were, identities. I mean, during the Harlem Renaissance and afterwards, lots of white people would go into those clubs because that's where they had the best music. Some of the best reggae bands in the world, I'm being told, are in Indonesia. And they're not considered foreign in Indonesia. They're just reggae bands who play good reggae music. So it's become a universal language. Rhythmic, popular music has become a universal language, uniting us more than it divides, just like the ocean.
Yes. Well, of course, in the Rastafari idiom, no one would utter the word universal. No, they would always say "I-niversal."
Yeah.
you know, the ludic language play of the Ethiopianist idiom, that Creole idiom, requires that the concept of you-ness is left outside.
Yes.
And that we understand our subjectivity in a radical intersubjectivity that language game reenacts every time we speak to each other. So universal.
Yes, yes. So, I mean, so one of the things that I thought this was interesting place to start a conversation was really to try to talk our way into the current situation regarding identity, racism, exclusion, and its alternatives, because it's not exactly, this moment is not exactly promising in some ways regarding these things. There seems to have been some regression.
Yes, very delicately put. Thank you. I think we've been, in the sessions that we've had so far under the banner of the Holberg Prize, we've been very, they've been rather pessimistic affairs, really. And I vowed that when we came here, we would try to have a more optimistic note sounded in the room. So yes, whether it's regression, I don't know if it's yes, it feels like regression. It does feel like regression. I mean, I know that if we say that, we'll be accused of being overly linear and so on. But yes, I think there is a regression. There is a kind of regressive modernization. Can we call it that? Of the political culture.
A withdrawal from the kind of complexity that emerged from this Black Atlantic historical movement, where in some ways modernity was invented because people had to reconstruct their identities as societies, and they had to piece all those disparate pieces together in something that seemed coherent and meaningful.
Yes, and of course the language of political nationalism seems to have been recharged and re-endowed with the capacity to anchor people and offer them forms of security that we didn't think that they would look to nationalism to supply.
No.
I mean, it's not only nationalism, of course, because I think in the work I've been doing on the alt-right, I've been more and more preoccupied with the relationship between nationalistic or ultra-nationalist forms of political discourse and a kind of argument about the nature of gender relations, which seems fundamental to the anxieties and the resentments that are surfacing in this moment.
Could you elaborate a bit on this?
Well, I know you have a language here about the left behinds and so on, and you have a civic discussion about the, I don't know, who's in a family and what kind of family it might be, and I think that for me was important to discover, because I think that there's a lot to add to that conversation. This image of these sort of, I mean, is it lonely? It's isolated. These often young men who find solace not only in the fantasies of a racially purified world, but in a world in which gender relations have somehow been restored to some natural hierarchy, which feminist sensibilities in many different generations now have somehow compounded and damaged. So the restoration of that natural hierarchy is also bounded up with the discovery of whiteness and the restoration of a racial hierarchy. And these things are counterpointed and closely connected. And perhaps, one could say that the internet culture fosters this link.
It certainly would among many. Hopefully not among everyone. But I mean, I think what you're talking about, a charitable interpretation of this move, the alt-right move, is that it's not so much about purity and boundaries, although that's the way it's being expressed. But it's very much about trying to find simple answers to complex questions in a world which is increasingly incomprehensible. Because things are changing so fast. And this is also, I think, to me, that's one of those, so what I think was, the Creole experience or the Caribbean, African-American experience is the ability of people to make sense of a world which is changing fast and which is chaotic, where you've lost basically everything. And yet managing to salvage just enough and reconstruct and create something new. So it's not as if it cannot be done.
Well, if that's true, and I think that's a useful starting point, then the role that we have to adopt has got to become quite different, because it means that instead of, prioritizing the historic role of critique, I'm saying that with a small c, not a capital C, that orientation, that constant and worthy and honorable negative mission has to be pushed to one side. And we have to take more risks, actually, about seeking to specify what we want to build, what can we bring into being in these adverse circumstances.
Yes.
And that requires daring, it requires boldness. And, you know, in the face of, it's not just the world, it's not just other people who have the problem of the world becoming incomprehensible.
No.
It's us as well, you know, or me anyway, not
Yeah,
you,
well,
clearly.
Oh yeah, I'm sure we all share that feeling sometimes.
Yeah,
but then you have a choice. I mean, you can accept that there are lots of things happening at the same time, and you don't have to sort of deal with all of it. And you have to find a way of maneuvering and finding your own paths through that jungle without having to know everything about every species of a plant and insect.
But we want to bring people with us as well.
Yes.
Actually, I think that reacquaintance with plants and insects might help. You know, I know they're disappearing at a great speed, but I do think that a kind of attentiveness, in a kind of small p political ecology, a kind of, these things can be orienting points.
Yeah.
And that, I suppose one of the reasons you respond in the way you do to the tropical downpour that isn't supposed to happen at this moment in the year, but just suddenly comes along and we become habituated to the normalness, the normality of that event, you know, suggests that attentiveness is something that can teach us something new about the world that we are going to have to deal with shortly.
Yes, let's return to that in a little while, because what we're talking about now is really, we in a roundabout way, the way in which we can live together, basically, and live with our similarities and our differences, and sort of try to turn this century into something positive rather than the end of civilization as we know it. And Paul has developed and he's worked quite a bit with the concept of conviviality, and I think we should return to that in a little while. But before that, we need to make some I think conceptual clarifications, because when you say diversity, certainly in this part of the world, people would immediately think, well, you're talking about multiculturalism, but it's not. And why is that? Can you just say a bit about, you know, the way you what is your critique of multiculturalism in this context?
Well, the language of multiculturalism suggests that cultures are fixed, knowable, bounded identities which hold you in place. And I don't see culture operating like that. So that's the first element of the critique. The second one would be to say that a sort of managerial, a kind of managerial view of cultural process, assimilation, and integration can be engineered governmentally, and so on. And I don't really, I know there are good things that can be done, but I wouldn't rely. They might be necessary, but they aren't really sufficient. So I'm uncomfortable with an over-integrated, a fixed understanding of bounded cultures. And to pluralize that, you know, I mean, I suppose there was a moment where seeing culture with an S on the end, shifting from culture to cultures, was a deeply radical insight. But to be stuck there with the snapshot of what that plurality was is insufficient. And the language of diversity, is very often, I think, something which is coming from the mainstream of a corporate culture, which sees the challenge of the present crisis of cultural relation as something that can be resolved by the diversification of the 1%.
Yes.
And the business school version of diversity is, though it's clearly useful tool or apparatus for the development of certain kinds of capitalist endeavor, which is ailing, actually, let's also say that, but is insufficient, clearly, for managing the larger problems and civic and political questions that are really encroaching into all our lives as the resurgence of, you know, neo-fascist sensibilities become something that we have to negotiate day by day.
Yeah, so we have to find a different ground, as it were, for creating collective identifications, loyalty, solidarity, etc.
Yes, and maybe that will be that the adjustment, we have to make some adjustments between how those things function at the level of the national state and how they operate locally or regionally. And I mean, you mentioned the North Sea earlier, and I think that's a very interesting example, because it may be that, you know, developments in the climate catastrophe will once again enable people to understand the possibility of a kind of North Sea interest that is. I mean, I was struck the other day. Obviously, Nigel Farage is a loathsome, but he was out in the first public event for his new party, the Brexit Party. He went to a place called Clacton, which is on the North Sea coast in Essex, and it's a very poor place actually, and in some ways quite homogenous. When I worked at Essex University, we used to always have our away days there in Clacton. And he pointed to the North Sea, and he said, "The North Sea? I can't." He actually said, "It was ours, it's our birthright." And then as the sentence developed, he acknowledged that there were Danes and Dutch and other people who might also have a stake in it. But, I mean, the grammar of the sentence, I can't, because I'm tired, recall the exact grammar of the sentence, but he was using the North Sea as an image, really, for his, you know, what's the word? More than regressive. It's hard to find the vocabulary to talk about the version of nationalism, because it's not authentic, actually. It's not real. You know, it's tempting to look at it and imagine it maps onto some sort of genuine fears, and that people are really concerned about the white working class and its fate, the so-called white working class. But these things are just symptoms, and they are elements in a political project which is really about winning attention. It's not substantively connected to the idea that the needs and sufferings of this group of people are going to be addressed by the political transformation he's seeking. But I just remember it because he pointed to the North Sea and used exactly that. Whereas I think I would say that in my optimistic moments, suggest that the nature of the catastrophe, which is really upon us actually, is one in which might promote new forms of identification, new political agents that will have to, whether we like it or not. And of course, Norwegians have a lot of space, a lot of land, even if the nature of the land is going to be transformed by what's already happening. So, you know, obviously you're going to have to accommodate difference and alterity in a way that has been absolutely unimaginable to you in previous phases of life.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, it's going to happen. I mean, I sometimes tell people that, you know, the immigrants we have here now on second and third generation with non-European background, it's just a foretaste of things to come. I mean, the way things are, and the thing is that we only have ourselves to blame if the cause is climate change, because we are one of the major exporters of oil and gas. But I'm thinking about, Paul, I mean, the way in which we can think about the way how to belong. Okay, multiculturalism not an option, because it's really nationalism writ small. And in fact, the concept of culture, I mean, as you know, on which multiculturalism is based, is the same concept of culture that is used in nationalist ideology. Absolutely. It goes back to Herder and the German romantics in the early 19th century. But you're also not too enthusiastic about the term hybridity.
Yes, well, the problem with hybridity, as I see it, is that it posits mixture as primary, but yet allows for the possibility that behind the mixture is a kind of earlier purity, an uncontaminated thing. Whereas I think I'm looking for a much more radical variety, which suggests that idea of an uncontaminated earlier moment or process is a fantasy itself. I mean, you ask about conviviality. I was, you know, it's Eid earlier this week, and during Ramadan, our local mosque, which has been in the news quite a lot in the last sort of 20 years, really. Finsbury Park Mosque in North London, the scene of the terrorist attack 2 years ago. We were invited, the whole community, in a radius of about a mile, or no, let me think now, say 3-kilometer radius from the mosque. People were leafleted and told that there would be an iftar at sunset in the street outside the mosque. And the street was closed off. The police came and closed off the street. And all our civic and local politicians, faith leaders, the police themselves came and wished everybody a very happy Ramadan. Our local MP, Jeremy Corbyn, came. not so satisfactory performance from him. He was a bit tired, I think, that night. Organized, choreographed by a lot of the young women activists around the mosque. And then we all tried to sit down in the street to have our iftar, vegan halal option provided. But, of course, there were so many people of all kinds from our neighborhood who came to this event. There was insufficient space for them to sit. We had to sit on a wall, actually, to have our iftar that evening. So I think, for me, this captured something of what I wanted to I wanted to get at with this idea of conviviality, because we're sharing a dwelling space. We're becoming present to each other by sharing a meal. We're physically proximate. And this conversation, you have to speak to the people who are sitting around. You can't just sit there, you know, on the ground with your, you know, airplane iftar in a tray. Although it was very, very good. I know the imam of the mosque has altered its internal workings by employing an extremely good cook there, so that many people want to come and eat inside the mosque, and expanding the allure of the place. Yeah. But this image of a community composed really in the everyday rituals that are here being enacted in the name of faith, but there was no element of that really that was you didn't have to. So people of all faiths and no faith are welcomed into the collective space that this initiative creates, and this is going on. And I think it was just a very moving and interesting example. Of course, you know, there's racism around there, there's intolerance there, but people are also most of the time able to work through and to solve those problems as they not all the time, but in many instances able to draw on the resources that they discover in becoming close to one another to solve those problems as they arise. And for me, that's the essence of conviviality. I'm not saying everything's rosy, everything's fine, there's no racism when we encounter each other. I'm saying that contact is productive, and a lot of social science literature wasn't interested in those effects of contact. There are rare instances, mostly drawn from anthropological literature, obviously, where that was given a conceptual value. But most of the time, that was not given a value. People were more concerned about assimilation, cultural process, this fixed and overly integrated sort of ethnic idea, ethnically absolute culture. You move from one to another. You can never be the logic of accretion. The Creole effect is not the issue. You know, you learn to be the way you have to be in order to win recognition. And I felt that this more organic, more complex, more multi-scalar relationship was somehow distilled into the evening we spent in the sunshine eating together.
Yeah. It certainly sounds like a good move. You know, if you take the reputation of the mosque, you can continuously say, Paul, I mean, this is promising and it's good and it's important because you create a public shared space where people can get to know each other. But it's not sufficient, and people carry with them all of this sort of historical, baggage of suffering and of current discrimination, which has deep historical roots, not least in Britain. So the fact that, you know, there is no black in the Union Jack, yes, there isn't. I mean, but the Union Jack is not a national flag. Really, I mean, it's a mongrel thing. It's composed of 3 crosses superimposed on each other: the English, the Irish, and the Scottish. And there was a small movement, probably inspired by your book, in the 90s, where they tried to insert some thin sort of black stripes into the Union Jack.
I've got one of those.
You do, huh?
Funnily enough, yes. The cat sits on it, so he doesn't make my
hair. All right. But I mean,
hairy.
But the point is that, you know, yes, this is. It's valid, you know, and it's important to have these spaces. And I think it's also important to emphasize that popular discourse and relationships between people with different backgrounds is often very different from the expectations you get from listening to politicians and reading the media.
Absolutely right. I mean, I think the issue of the national flag is interesting. We don't like to call it the Union Jack. You know, we prefer to call it the butcher's apron, as it was known for so many years, particularly in Ireland. I see it as a kind of work in progress. When people ask me about it, I remember some years ago the road protester movement. I know this is a matter of local interest at the moment, but the people who were opposing the extension of a car-centric view of privatized transportation. The people who were against road building produced their own version of the flag, which they called the Union Jill, which had the kind of geometry but not the color scheme of the other one, the butcher's apron. And this brought home to me the idea that the flag is a work in progress. Actually, it has changed, it has evolved, and it can change some more in the future. I'm sure it will change more in the future, not least, of course, when the Scots abandon us and decide to throw in their lot with the EU, which is a kind of inevitable outcome now of the situation that we occupy.
Which leaves the English with the St. George's Cross, which has very different connotations.
Well, yes, but I mean, I don't know how much people know about St. George, but in what sense he might be thought of as English is rather disputed.
They have that as a national flag in Georgia.
Well, it's the Georgian example I was thinking of,
But still, I mean, one thing is, okay, living together in a space. What else does it take apart from having these shared public spaces?
Right. Well, actually, in the instance that we're talking about, I would also say that it involves developing a kind of committed anti-racist political project, and one in which that really faces up to the way in which the figure of the Muslim is a racial figure. And, the history of juggling racial and religious identities against one another in Europe is relevant to this new outcome, this new image of the Muslim as a racial trope, really. So I think one of the other things we can do is to highlight that and to use the historical precedent of genocidal violence directed at religious minorities who were also heavily racialized in the earlier parts of the 20th century as a hermeneutic frame to make sense of some of the risks involved in casually racializing Muslims rather than seeing them as a faith group.
Yes, I guess so. I was going to ask you about that, about the relationship, how you see it between, you might say, classic racism and Islamophobia, which has been on the rise now, and which is very much becoming a target for the new right, or not even the new right, but the new centre, perhaps, in European politics, as the other, the quintessential other. It carries with it different historical baggage and different cultural, as it were, symbolic connotations from people of African origin, doesn't it?
Well, it certainly does, and I think it relates, in my own mind, to a number of questions that are not foregrounded. People look at the question of assimilation in a very simplistic way. I mean, I think it's very hard to explain the genocidal violence of the Third Reich without foregrounding the figure of the assimilated Jew, actually. Because if the Jew is in the shtetl with side locks and living in a quartered space, that's a problem. It may be a problem of hygiene and racial science. But it is a secondary problem to the assimilated Jew, the Jew that speaks your language the same way you do, the Jew that writes poetry in your language, the Jew that performs your music and looks and moves and behaves like you. So in a way, the violence which is directed at the figure of the assimilated Jew or the assimilated I would say the assimilated Muslim also is because they don't look and conduct themselves the way the anthropological lexicon of difference tells them they should function. And that, I think Zygmunt used to call it proteophobia, because you can see the not really knowing who you're dealing with, having to check to make sure, and the lexicon of anthropology lets you down at that point badly. So what do? You reduce or produce that person as what they should have been, but weren't. And I think we do face a number of problems like that. If we stay within the language of integration and assimilation, we have to develop a different way of seeing that process.
I certainly believe we do. And one of the strange things about the way in which minorities are being talked about is that either they're too assimilated and they're too much like us, and that makes them sort of the alien inside, as in certain science fiction films from 1950s and 60s, where you had these aliens from other planets and whose aim was world domination and probably the extermination of the human race, and they looked exactly like us. You see, either it's that, or it's that. Oh, they're so different, and they don't want to be like us, and they're withdrawing, from our common culture, etc. So we probably need a new language, and that's why that's why we have people like you to help us developing that language. So conviviality is one place to start.
One place to do that. Yes, that's what I would hope. I've been happy. One of the things we did in Bergen was to have a number of doctoral candidates from different Nordic countries in a workshop on conviviality, and we looked at a number of local studies produced in different parts, different writers within the British Academy, I think one or two others from outside, but mostly, even though they're not British people, they're working in that system. And it was a very rich discussion exactly on this point, but it left me feeling that this works very well if we're dealing with local questions.
Yes.
But to begin to think about them, to zoom out and to have a different, if you like, a different resolution in the portrait that we make of these processes is a very difficult thing to do. I mean, it may be that your kind of approach, which is so strongly and tenaciously comparative in character, is some other element in this which makes it clearer for people to comprehend.
Yeah, or maybe we could think about these connections in terms of, obviously you think in terms of rhizomatic connections and not roots, as it were, not botanical, but they spread out. So they're transnational and they're connected in unpredictable ways, not least in this era of global communication. So all of a sudden you meet people in Indonesia who like the same kind of reggae music as you do. So you connect with them, or you meet up with people, or you connect with people in New Zealand who have the same persuasions as you do regarding politics. So you connect with them. So you could have all of these sort of overlapping rhizomatic transnational connections. But this requires that one does not see sameness as a requirement for living in the same place.
And it maybe means that we have to abandon the language of identity altogether, actually.
At least that kind of language.
In its reified condition, in its mathematical notion of seriality and so on. Perhaps, the language of affinity might be more useful to capture something of that pattern.
Yeah, what struck me when you spoke about the iftar, the public iftar in Finsbury Park, is place. That that place somehow trumps, if I may use that word, some of those other ways in which people identify. People live in the same place, and for that reason they have something in common.
Indeed, and when the terrorist attack happened 2 years ago, the spontaneous response from people was, we will not be divided. Yeah. We will not be divided. So when the children of the man who was murdered by I won't say his name, I know we don't like to do that. A man who was radicalized by watching a BBC documentary about sexual predation by Muslim men, who his wife said to the judge in the courtroom, he got a bit of a bee in his bonnet about Muslims before he went off. And this wasn't somebody who was... I know my country is a horrible exporter of white supremacist content online to the world. It's not just the United States that's the source of a lot of this. And of course there are what we might call disinhibiting effects that relate to the computer mediation of these forms of political communication. But we have a lot to fix in terms of the way that a lot of that white supremacist content is being exported worldwide from our country.
Yes. I'm sure we do. So do you feel that the term polarization is accurate for describing the ideological divide that we see in all of these countries now, on nativism versus a more sort of open or Europeanist or whatever cosmopolitan view?
Well, no, I think we passed that point, and you identified where it had been left behind when you spoke about the transformed nature of the mainstream and the fact that people in the mainstream compete with the ultra-right by simply repeating their habits and bringing their agenda into a mainstream position as a way of trying to win. Now, obviously, that's a disastrous strategy, but it's one we see everywhere we look. And if we think about recent development, or the whole Windrush scandal, which I know was something that people here were thinking about and watching with horror at a distance. This is an effect really of, well, it's an effect of several things. Our not quite prime minister was somebody who
does reveal all the kind of prejudices, small-mindedness and narrowness of her class and generation. The Federation of Conservative Students in Oxford University circa 1975, you know. And the obsession with immigration comes from that world in which the nationalism and the xenophobia and the Little England mentality of the right of the Conservative Party at a certain point was the law, and the law, L-A-W-L-O-R-E. But it's also to do with the fact that when they repeat the slogans and the mentality of the ultra-right, they think they can hold a political bloc together. And it isn't just the Conservatives who've done that. I mean, if anyone remembers Gordon Brown, the intellectual prime minister, the one that bit his nails, he was somebody who would mimic the fascist slogans, you know, British jobs for British workers. He would parrot these things as a way of trying to hold together the left electoral bloc. So it's not, unfortunately, just something which comes from the right. It comes from both. They see that playbook as the only template in town, that the motifs of that populism will always open them they'll want to reach for the racial image of the country. They'll want to blur the relationship between race and nation because they think that's how you win. Tony Blair, let's talk about him, 1997, standing on the white cliffs of Dover with a bulldog called Fritz. You know, this was ironic, apparently.
Yeah,
and
I'm sure. Yeah,
and the only other political leader that stood on the white cliffs of Dover in 1977 election that brought New Labour into power was the leader of the fascist British National Party at that time, John Tyndall. So, you know, although we might say at the moment, come Black Tony Blair, you were an adult at least, you knew what you were doing, or it appeared you knew what you were doing until your militaristic impulses got the better of you. The fact is, someone like that is also culpable for trying to think you can play with these motifs, you can play with this thing. Actually, I see that as part of the process which gives us the outcome of the crisis we've got right now.
Yeah. And in a sense, you might say, you predicted in some ways, at least you made this easiest to understand this transition in your book published about 15 years ago, the one called After Empire, where you speak about this post-imperial melancholia. And even countries which didn't have an empire as such, I think, have some of that melancholia.
Yes,
okay?
We want to be great again. It's a different conception of political time.
Yeah, you know, in this country, I mean, a small grocery store used to be called colonial because you brought commodities from the colonies. As early as the 19th century, you had that connection with the colonies. You got your coffee and sugar and tobacco and so on. So the melancholia makes it more understandable, isn't it, that people are regressing into Little Englandism.
Well, I'm not very sympathetic, actually, to that impulse. I know that for many people, the melancholic reaction is the condition of politics in general, right? And this was something really that came out of the movement around AIDS and HIV. Don't mourn, mobilize. We mustn't mourn, we mustn't work through. We keep the wound as a condition of galvanizing a certain political solidarity in the world. I've always been irritated by that, because it seems to me that in Freud's work anyway, the idea of the melancholic reaction has a pathological aspect, and I want to hold on to the pathology of that gesture. Let's work through. What are the resources we need to work through the trauma of the past? What are the resources that we need in order to inscribe a healthier understanding of ourselves and our political community? And looking at racism is a stimulus to thinking about that, I think, and it's been useful, because often what you find is not just that a different political time has been sought, has been pursued. I suppose Reagan maybe, or the Reagan-Thatcher moment was the one where people began to think about making the country great again, and it's looped round and round. Yeah. But it's also, I think, something that we can understand better when we appreciate that the hatred that one bears towards that other person, that alien intruder, is really a kind of self-hatred, which has been expressed against them because of the complicated relations of identification and desire that engulf that pair, that unhappy pair. So winning an understanding of that violence is sourced in a hatred of the self would also be, I think, a necessary counterpart to the political motifs that seek the instantiation of a new political time in which we get our greatness back, we get our country back, we recover this transparency of a mythic past which was never ever there.
No, it's never ever there. And to the extent it was fairly dreadful for most of the people affected, and even for some of the transgressors. So that's, I mean, that would be what you're describing, and what you describe in the book also is a reactionary view in the real sense of the word.
Yes.
That you want to turn the clock back. But I was wondering again if there is something here to be learned about the transatlantic experience and about the kind of openness and the kind of, you might say, optimism and creativity that came out of that terrible, and openness to the world, and generosity that came out of that historical experience. And I wonder if we could try to shed a bit of light on that by rewinding a bit and going back to Du Bois, whom you mentioned just very briefly. W.E.B. Du Bois, very significant major social theorist and sociologist, early 20th century, and who, among other things, coined the term double consciousness, that you've made use of in some of your earlier work. Double consciousness is, you know,
Well, he's a fascinating figure, and I think he's a fascinating figure because he was a Germanophile.
Yes.
Somebody who identified so much with elements of Europe, and he took over and adapted the kind of dialectical and idealist features of German romantic and post-romantic philosophical thinking, and adapted them into an understanding of the predicament of African Americans. And this has been a very productive and interesting addition to the well, he's the one who made it a political tradition. Let me put it like that. Both through his Pan-Africanist phase, also I think as a kind of Fabian socialist of a certain kind for many years, someone who was so overeducated and overtrained as an academic and a scholar that they found university life impossible because nobody would employ them. So when he eventually gets a job, he couldn't get a job. He ends up teaching classics of all things, and then finds life in the black college unbearable, goes to the white university to teach sociology because he'd been influenced by Herbert Spencer and wanted sociological rationality to be enlisted into the freedom project of African Americans. And he thought, as he'd encountered Weber and Simmel and others in his life in Germany as a student, preparing his PhD in economics, he really thought the sociological rationality could be annexed for that freedom struggle. Well, this doesn't go. I mean, the history of sociology in the United States is an interesting. Of course, he produces the first really big sociological monograph in the form of the Philadelphia Negro, but can't live in a university like that either. So leaves and becomes, I suppose, what we would nowadays call an activist, a publisher, someone who's producing this extraordinary magazine, The Crisis. If anyone, it's all online now. I think held in the archive at Brown University. You can look at that rich and incredible publication. I mean, you know, it's a wonderful insight into that moment. He comes to Europe again to participate in the Versailles talks. He's in the room as well there, and begins to frame this political dream in which I think I mentioned it momentarily earlier on, in which the peoples of the imperial world are synchronized in their opposition to colonial power. And one slight flaw in his novelistic rendering of it, I suppose, rather typical of African American intellectuals in that moment, is that he sees the Japanese as the leaders of this because of the war with Russia and so on. Now, Du Bois, I got interested in a different aspect of Du Bois recently, and that is his interest in and relation with the Baha'i faith, because he and Alan Locke, of course, his sort of philosophical sparring partner for a number of years. Alan Locke stayed Baha'i and was quite a prominent official in the institutionalized life of the Baha'i church. I suppose I should call it a church. It is a church.
Guess,
movement church. But what's interesting about this was not the fact that the Baha'i in the United States and in South Africa refused to hold segregated worship, which made them attractive. I think it was more that the distance between the particular and the universal is very small in that outlook. And this made it very, very attractive to Du Bois. And he was somebody who renounced it only and and left it behind only when he saw that they were, in fact, in some instances in the US South, allowing segregation back in. But in South Africa, for example, a lot of militants, a lot of people from the Garvey movement also went into the Baha'i church for similar kinds of reasons. Sorry, I'm being a Du Bois bore. I do have that.
Not at all.
I have that tendency.
Not at all.
I was thinking really more about. I was just going to say about his move into a kind of Cold War politics. The American government took away his passport for 8 years. He couldn't travel. And what's interesting, he lived a long life. At the end of his life, in his 90s, he renounces his US citizenship. He moves to Ghana and he joins the Communist Party. So this is a very interesting journey.
A long and interesting trajectory. And he spoke about the double consciousness through which the colonized or the black person has to see himself both the way he is and also through the eyes of the hegemonic majority society. And this is a figure that reappears in some of your work and which is clearly very recognizable for many people belonging to minorities in Europe today.
I think that's true, and there are ways in which the later generations of Black Atlantic thinkers also built on these insights. One thinks of Fanon speaking of, having to be black in relation to the white, of seeing, I suppose, through his psychiatric training, the mechanisms of identification and differentiation, and others too who've really built on it, but not, as in Du Bois, sought a kind of dialectical resolution, have left the different elements in place and seen where they grate against one another, and not seek to see them synthesized in any way.
Yes. So perhaps we should all try to develop a bit of double consciousness in order to be able to see ourselves in a new light, also the way we are seen from the outside. Maybe that would help.
Isn't that, there is an Enlightenment motif there, isn't there, that one seeks to understand or to articulate a systematic estrangement from the culture that shapes you as a condition of comprehending it.
Yeah, it's one of my favorite quotations from Goethe, where he says that he who knows no foreign language knows nothing about his own. So you have to be able to see yourself from the outside in order to understand who you are.
Exactly.
So we actually will be running out of time. We could have gone on for hours, obviously, but we can't, we don't, and we won't. So the floor is now open for questions. I can't really see you well. Now I can see you better. So the floor is open. Who wants to begin? Nobody ever wants to begin. That's a universal law. Nobody wants to ask the first question, and then you get the ketchup effect afterwards.
Come on, Sindra.
Yeah.
We're relying on you.
Sindra, where are you? Oh, there you are. Yeah.
I promised I wouldn't say anything.
Who did you promise?
I promised Thomas.
Oh, okay. Oh, sorry.
Yeah, you're okay. I mean, I never accepted that promise.
Oh, okay, good.
I was kind of intrigued by your being Du Bois core in this context, because there's I really don't know whether you've come across this, but there's also a fascinating story which I picked up in my years doing field work in Cape Town, South Africa. There's a character by the name of Joseph Perdue who arrived in Cape Town in the 1950s, and this becomes big scandal because he passes himself off as a Muslim, but he's from Baha'i, but it takes the local Muslims several years to discover this. And I was thinking in terms of if you could possibly expand. I'm not sure whether this is going very far, but I didn't really get to what was it in the Baha'i faith that attracted
Du Bois and Locke.
And how could we possibly think of this? Because this is, I don't know whether it's correct to characterize the Baha'i faith as syncretistic, right?
Well, I mean, I'm not an expert in Baha'i theology, but I think we could say that for people who are entirely unfamiliar with this as I don't want to call it a sect, as a movement which breaks away from an Islam which has been identified strongly with persecution in its history, which asserts the unity of all religious orientation, which dissolves the wall between the monotheistic religions, which, as a result of its sort of planetarity, its commitment to the oneness of humankind, can entertain no racial divisions. I mean, of course, there are versions of Christianity which have these features, you know, Anabaptism and other forms of Christianity which share that. I imagine there are always movements within religious groupings that tend towards the universal. We used to be friends with a Mennonite family who would explain to us over the dinner table in the most lucid way that nationalism was a heresy. Mm-hmm. And of course, that was reflected in their own political activism. So I think we can find comparable patterns in a number of places, but I think they're very strong in the Baha'i, and the Baha'u'llah's son, Abdul Baha, toured the United States at a very early point, and I mean, there are people nodding, so maybe they know more about it than I do. But I suppose I felt that the people look at the work of Du Bois and they think of him as a nationalist and a socialist, and eventually a communist, and sometimes a Pan-Africanist, but they aren't inclined to think of him as somebody whose universalism is not the universalism of the left. This is what interests me, who sought a different vehicle, a different set of histories, resources, languages, traditions with which to articulate the commitment to the universal. And that's why I find it interesting.
It may even be that some of these, you might say, mixed or diverse societies lend themselves also more easily to this kind of project. I remember I had a friend in Trinidad years ago when I did fieldwork who was of Syrian origin. Well, it was really probably Lebanese, but Lebanon didn't exist as a state at the time when his great-grandparents migrated. And he became a unity pastor. And unity has, as a sort of a religious movement, has a similar kind of project, a kind of smallest common denominator for everyone, kind of idea.
Yes, I mean, it's probably... the effects are the same when it's reached for. I mean, Locke, of course, Alain Locke, the midwife of the Harlem Renaissance and so on, was not just somebody who'd read the aesthetic theories of Walter Pater while he was the first African-American Rhodes Scholar in Oxford. He was also somebody who was institutionally involved in the life of the Baha'i Church because of his his abilities as a linguist, and was someone who's very involved in custodianship of the Baha'i archive in Haifa, and visited there almost as frequently as he went to Bayreuth to enjoy the festival there until the Nazis prevented him from going there anymore.
Yeah. What a story! I mean, the Baha'i. I've been to that Baha'i church in Haifa, and it's huge, and it's totally unexpected. Anyway, a question over here. If you could stand up, please, so that people at the back can hear you.
University, and my question is, actually I don't have a question, I have a couple of points which you could clarify and get some perspective. You mentioned about this rise of natural hierarchies, for instance, and I recently read a book which was pretty influential called... Yeah, it's on. Yeah. So you mentioned about natural hierarchies and this idea of white identity becoming a bit assertive. I recently read a very popular book. I'm sure you heard of it, like the 12 Rules for Life, wherein Professor Peterson he mentions about this, how he connects in a very interesting way how we are like lobsters, and talks about how hierarchies are so deep-seated, and kind of brings back the idea of natural hierarchy. So how I'm curious, how do you counter that kind of story, which is very kind of gaining a lot of traction and it's pretty compelling. At the same time, in Britain, a professor called as Roger Scruton, for instance, he has been talking about melancholy and this idea of the church or the religion going away from the center, public square, if you will, and how the lack of that and the way in which culture, like or art, and could not replace it, and then now we are kind of being a bit polarized, and so we want to retain back and go back to that point wherein we cling to something which is a fictitious mythological past. If you could reflect upon that and this debate of how globalized identity is perhaps creating a stronger urge to assert an identity which is a bit more parochial. Yeah, thank you.
Well, I did actually, when I was exhausted from preparing my material for the Holberg rituals, I did spend an idle afternoon stroking the cat and watching a conversation between Roger Scruton and Jordan Peterson, which I'm sure many people have. I don't know why I'm telling you this, actually.
That's okay.
It's a kind of confession of a sort. And I think I can't think of two people who are less useful as as axes for the kind of conversation that we should be having about these matters, really. I mean, I think, you know, Scruton, although he is judged to be a very distinguished character, I think he came here recently to speak at the some sort of military club.
Yes, I think
yes. But he's been, you know, he's been someone who dignifies the most odious neo-fascist opinions with the imprimatur of his philosophical authority for a very long time. I'm sorry if that sounds ad hominem. It's not intended to. Mm-hmm. It's really a historical comment, actually, even though I think some elements of his approach resonate quite strongly with me to the extent that he does at least say, and maybe this comes more easily to a practicing communicant of the Church of England, that one should be mourning. He's not actually melancholic. He wants to mourn for England. He wrote a book called An Elegy for England. He wants to mourn. Mm-hmm. You know, he's not doing the mourning, but he wants to be able to. And I think I would like to help him do that more. With regard to, I mean, the question of the restoration of natural, I suppose, yes, I was talking about the idea that one can restore natural hierarchy in the world as a solution to the anxieties and resentments and confusion and disorientation, which are such a marked feature of the moment that we're in. Yes. So the answer becomes a sort of therapeutic one. We'll make the world simpler again. We'll put it back into the shape that it used to occupy. Yeah. And, you know, I mean, I'm not really qualified to say anything helpful about Jordan Peterson because I haven't really read his book. But his celebrity, and I think the issue of his celebrity is a relevant thing, means that he's really a mainstream popular figure who's contributing to the discourse of injured or perennially wounded masculinity. So the answer, I mean, we know what the answer is. The question is, what does the patient look like? And how does the ailment which is being salved correspond to the moment we're in and to the proliferation of, well, let's be blunt and say, you know, isolated, lonely, miserable, and unhappy people, often, I think, you know, whose injuries and whose predicament is compounded by the relationship to the technologies of communication and leisure and consumption. So I want to address that. The man I mentioned in court who did the terrorist attack in Finsbury Park and other of these quote unquote lone wolves that we can identify, the people that do that damage, are radicalized online. So I would suggest there's something about the online culture which helps to explain the celebrity of Jordan Peterson and the nature of the movement of which he forms part. This isn't a political party, so it's not under a discipline of a political party. It doesn't have, you know, an ideology in the formal sense. And the forms of action that it engages in may be no more than pressing a like or a click or something like that. And it's not managed through real-time interaction. And so I think there are a number of issues about the celebrity of Jordan Peterson and the way that celebrity's been built, and the way, again, it's actually a parallel to the point Thomas made earlier on about the effects of the ultra right in the political mainstream. you know, except in the case of Peterson, what's going on is that the publishers are mainstreaming these anxieties because they know that there's an enormous amount of money to be made from these anxieties, these insecurities, these forms of loneliness.
Yeah, I mean, there are lots of academics who could be manufactured as global celebrities, and why him, and why now? Well, I mean, the short answer, I think, is that both he and Roger Scruton, I mean, what they are doing is massaging fossils in their own brains and telling everybody else to do the same. Those lonely young people, I mean, do this and you'll be okay. That's a good sort of source of comfort. So good luck with that, you know.
Well, I mean, it's more sinister in the case of Scruton than that, because I think what he's doing is he's taking the opinions of people like Tommy Robinson and the other, you know, fringe figures of the ultra-right, the populist voice of the ultra-right, and he's dressing them up in a sort of philosophical, you know, filigree. A philosophical filigree which makes them look more interesting, more respectable, more authoritative, more serious than they really are. He's, you know, he's the voice of the taxi driver you wish you weren't with in the cab, to me.
Yeah. So we're really out of time, but we have time for one more question. Elisabeth?
Thanks for an enlightening conversation. But talking about enlightenment, I was thinking of the double consciousness and the way you suggested this as a process of enlightenment. And I can agree in many cases, yes. But if you talk, it has to do with context, I believe, too. Because when Sartre wrote his on the Jewish question, he talks about how the Jews internalized the majority view on them, and that was a kind of negative spiraling process. So I wonder if, what does it take for this to go from the positive enlightenment position to a position where actually the majority view sort of affects your negative sense of identity? And I have one more small question, if I may, because very much of the mobilization of the right, or the ultra-right nowadays, is due to, or not due to, but it's focused on the refugee situation. Yes. And we talked about place, right? And when we talk about place, and then Bauman talks about the refugees as being in a non-placement, liquid times. And the non-placement might be, of course, a physical place, but very often times unrelated to other places where they can meet people. More and more isolations, islands, which are proposed in Denmark nowadays, and so on. Yes. So then again, the deprivation of place is an issue here also, isn't it?
Yes, I mean, we've been thinking a lot about this, of course, because one of the most interesting features of the moment is that the English Channel, so-called La Manche, is becoming the Mediterranean. It's becoming the Mediterranean. I was looking at the numbers of the people who are being picked up out of the water there, and this is a massive crisis which is brewing, and of course is only being held at bay at the moment because our government, like the Australian government and other governments, has taken a much tighter grip on what can be shown and what can be seen. So I think there's a politics of visibility which has a significance with that. I mean, that image of the you know, what's the name of the man who wrote The Camp of Saints, the novel The Camp of Saints? I can't remember his name. The French man. No, Vron, can you remember the? It'll come to me in a moment. I'm sorry, I'm a bit tired. That image of the kind of invasive presence is really actually an argument about the nature of a kind of warfare, and the slogan of the identitarians, of these groups, often actually crowdfunded online. The people that 3 years ago. The Canadians and Lauren Southern and Katie Hopkins and these sort of online figures, you know, they crowdfunded the boat that went out into the Mediterranean it was called the Sea Star, which prevented people from rescuing people from the water, and of course Salvini has now criminalized all of this activity. So I think that these images and these histories and the way that they are articulated and rendered really as forms of warfare help to feed both the construction of place that you spoke of and the analogy which joins the predicament of the refugee to the cipher of warfare as a moment in which the nation really understands itself in a richer and more compelling way. Because it's when we're at war that we really know who we are, and peace is really bad for us because it takes us further away from our character as a national community.
Yeah. And our historical mission. I'm sorry, I'm afraid we're basically out of our time. It was up about 7 minutes ago, so I'm sorry, we have to take that bilaterally afterwards. But I'm sure that you might be available for a couple of bilateral questions.
Yes,
after
privately,
this.
of course.
So on that note, thank you all for coming. And as you realize, Paul Gilroy is a very, very deserving and important and worthy recipient of the Holberg Prize, and I believe this marks the end of the formal proceedings. So you can now go home and relax with your cat and whatever you like to, whatever debates you'd like to follow in London. So thanks so much for coming, Paul. It's been a real pleasure to have you here and a great honor. And thank you all for coming.